Gladwell said in his book is that he called it the magic number of true expertise, okay, is 10,000 hours. And in fact, there is no magic number of true expertise. The 10,000 hour rule is a myth. What we've consistently found in our research is that people vary greatly in the amount of practice that they require to reach a certain level of skill.
Hello, my name is Noah Sachs. Today's guest is Dr. Zack Hambrick. He is the lab director at the Expertise Lab at Michigan State University. He is also a professor of psychology. He and his team research the origins and underpinnings of expert performance. They conduct research on a wide variety of topics, including sports, music, and chess. The ultimate goal of the Expertise Lab is to help develop insights into how one can learn complex skills efficiently and improve performance. This is my conversation with Dr. Zack Hambrick. The first part I wanted to go into is summarizing the key findings. If you could summarize. So the paper is titled, What Makes a Champion? Early Multidisciplinary Practice, Not Early Specialization, Predicts World-Class Performance. So before we're going to dive deep into the real details of it, but could you kind of provide an overview of what someone has 2 minutes, what they need to know, what's the findings?
Right. Okay. So here's the basic story. What are the patterns of activities beginning in a sport that are most conducive to reaching a high level of skill ultimately? And there are kind of two perspectives on this question. One is called the early specialization view, and this says that the optimal approach is to begin as early as possible in childhood and to focus on one sport exclusively. Kind of the poster child for this in golf and any other sport really is Tiger Woods. Tiger Woods, as we all know, began practicing under the supervision of his father as soon as he could walk. Okay. Now, the other view says that it's actually better to specialize a bit later and to have more diverse early experience playing a range of sports and practicing and training in a range of sports. And an example of this would be from tennis would be Roger Federer. And I think from golf, Jordan Spieth might be a good example of this. He played multiple sports. He's talked about this in interviews, played multiple sports in addition to golf. And so here we have these two viewpoints. And the question is, well, what does the evidence indicate? They're compelling anecdotes to support both viewpoints. And so what we wanted to say is, well, what's the truth as well as we can ascertain it from the available evidence. And so we did, actually now there are two papers, the original study, the original meta-analysis where we gathered all the available evidence on these two perspectives, and then more recently an update on that. And so at present, we've summarized evidence from 71 studies that collected data that we could include in our meta-analysis to look at which seems to be closer to the truth. And overwhelmingly, the evidence suggests that we're reaching the highest level of performance at the senior level of competition, the ultimate level of competition, not the junior level, is actually a somewhat later starting age and more diverse early experience with other sports. Now, we can get into the details as we go along in that, but that's the basic finding. So you take a case like Tiger Woods. He turns out to be the exception rather than the rule. This is not to say that there aren't people like Tiger Woods who have started really early and reached an elite level, but in general, the elite performers, say PGA Tour golfers, okay, the expectation based on our findings is that they have more diverse early experience with multiple sports and specialize relatively still in childhood, but relatively late.
Yeah. And I think that's an important part. You're saying you're looking at it from the success being determined as at adulthood at the
Correct.
elite level, not necessarily success at a junior level.
Well,
because that's an important part as well.
Actually, and you raise a critical point here. We also looked at achieving success at the junior level, okay? And it turns out that the predictors of achieving success at the junior level are opposite to those of achieving success at the senior level. So for the junior level, the elite level, think about the winning Rolex Player of the Year, that kind of thing. Those people tend to focus very early and specialize very early, but by the same token, they don't tend to go on to become elite at the senior level, which is an intriguing finding. So it's as if the players who ultimately reach the highest level, they progress somewhat more slowly and then ramp up. The elite juniors, they shoot to the top, but infrequently do they actually go on to the same level of success as adults.
Absolutely. And so in the paper, there's this early specialization and this early diversification approach. And later in a minute, I want to go into essentially the alternative hypothesis, which is the details of, it's not as simple as saying, oh, just play a lot of sports as a kid, that's it. And then I want to go into the three main points you guys outlined. But before that, I know, especially with your research expertise, is this role of deliberate practice.
Right.
And that could be a whole separate episode just talking about deliberate practice.
Yeah.
But could you talk about the role of deliberate practice within this early specialization, early diversification? Because I know that it's different than what the mainstream narrative is and how it's been popularized, how important that is. So if you want to touch on that, I would appreciate that.
Okay, I'll explain how that fits in here. Okay, so deliberate practice is a term that was coined by the late Florida State University psychologist Anders Ericsson. And Ericsson said that deliberate practice was, at the most general level, practice with the specific goal of improving your performance in some domain beyond the current level. You might think of it as serious training as opposed to just fooling around, whether it's hitting golf balls on the range, working with an instructor, any number of sort of training exercises and activities where the goal is to elevate your current level of performance. And, you can think in golf of countless examples of what might qualify as deliberate practice. And in the early 90s, Ericsson and his colleagues published what became a really highly influential paper on musicians. And what they showed is that in a sample of both violinists and then also a sample of pianists, they showed that the most accomplished musicians had accumulated the greatest number of hours of this deliberate practice, which they kind of operationally defined as practice alone, with the goal of improving performance. Okay. Now, they argued that that we talk about differences across people in accomplishment in some domain. They argue that you can largely explain these differences across people in terms of the amount of deliberate practice that they have accumulated. They said it's the biggest factor in explaining why, I'm a 6 handicap, or, and you're a scratch or whatever. And so I actually worked with Anders Ericsson a summer when I was in graduate school, and we had a kind of a professional correspondence for quite some time. Ultimately, I kind of became a bit skeptical of some of the evidence that was being put forth to make this case that deliberate practice is this very important factor in explaining differences across people, individual differences in acquired level of skill. And I beginning in around 2009 or 2010, started trying to empirically scientifically test some of the hypotheses that came out of this deliberate practice view. And the short story is, what I found is that, deliberate practice is one important factor in explaining differences across people in accomplishment, in sports and music and other things. But it's not the only factor, and it's not even necessarily the most, the biggest contributor. Not necessarily. So this kind of sparked a debate in the scientific literature. My colleagues and I went back and forth with Anders Ericsson, trying to make our case based on the available evidence for our viewpoints. And what I have still believe, based on the evidence that we've been able to gather, is that there's more to the story than just deliberate practice in explaining why some people reach a high level of performance in a sport or in music or in a profession or whatever. And one of these factors, actually maybe a collection of factors, is what we might call talent. Okay. We might think of talent as basic abilities and capacities that are at least in part influenced by our genotype. Okay. Things that we're born with, DNA. Now, how does this all fit into the early specialization and late specialization? Okay. Views. What those views basically stipulate is when deliberate practice should begin. Okay. The early specialization view says that deliberate practice, this focused practice, trying to get better, elevate your performance in one particular thing, should begin as early as possible. Okay. And why is that? Well, if you're maximizing the amount of deliberate practice that you can engage in without burnout, then the earlier the better your start, because someone who starts later can never catch up to someone who starts early, right? The later specialization viewpoint, with early diversification, says that it can be detrimental to start deliberate practice too early. Both viewpoints accept the importance of deliberate practice. Okay, serious training. But what they differ in is when deliberate practice should commence, essentially. And that's
that makes sense.
That's how deliberate practice fits in here. And those are the two contrasting views on when deliberate practice should begin.
So before we go on to the details of this kind of nuance, what are the details of this late specialization is, I mean, a lot of people have heard of this 10,000 hour rule.
Right.
There's a lot of popular books out there. So really what you're saying from the research is not that simple to say, yeah, I need to put in 10,000 hours of concentrated work by myself. And that means, and I think you even published a paper that researched the journey of a aspiring PGA Tour player who was trying to put in 10,000 hours and ultimately failed. Is that right?
Right. That's right. Right. Well, the 10,000 hour rule, it came from Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers, and kind of the inspiration for this rule was Anders Ericsson's work. Other people actually had talked about kind of the notion that there's some certain minimum level of practice that you need to become an expert. Other people had talked about it, but it would seem that the inspiration for the 10,000 hour rule was Ericsson's work. And the notion, what Gladwell said in his book is that he called it the magic number of true expertise, okay, is 10,000 hours. And in fact, there is no magic number of true expertise. The 10,000 hour rule is a myth. What we've consistently found in our research is that people vary greatly in the amount of practice that they require to reach a certain level of skill. Take the game of chess, okay? A master level chess player is a very good chess player. Certainly someone colloquially we would call an expert, okay? And so how much practice does it take people to become a master level chess player? My colleague, Guillermo Campitelli, who I co-founded the Journal of Expertise with, he's in Perth, Australia. He did a study using chess players, and he found that the amount of practice, self-reported practice, that the sample of players required to reach the master level in chess ranged from about 3,000 hours to well over 20,000 hours. And moreover, there were some people in the sample who, even with over 20,000 hours of practice, had still not reached master level. Okay. Now, as a golf instructor, you can certainly appreciate that some students progress a lot more rapidly than others. I mean, everybody wants to be a scratch player, who comes in to take golf lessons. Not everybody, but you know. And it takes some people are just not going to make it to that level. I still hold out hope that I may one day, but something, I'm kind of now comfortable with the fact that, man, that just may not be in the cards. But the truth of the matter is that there is a great deal of variability in how long it takes people to reach what could be considered an expert level of performance.
Understood. Yeah. And so let's switch gears a bit now and kind of go into the details of this alternative hypothesis. So generally the message so far has been that early diversification, so playing a variety of sports, and a somewhat later somewhat later focus into one path is more likely to result in elite level performance at an adult level. But essentially in the paper you bring up three hypotheses that are interrelated. So I want to kind of go through those one by one. So the first one is the sustainability hypothesis. So what is what is that? Because they're all going to be connected, but I want to kind of break them down one by one for people to understand.
And let me actually kind of put in give some framing on what this refers to. Okay, so the basic question, again, what we found is that we looked at both junior level and senior level performers, and we found that where reaching an elite level at the adult level is concerned, the senior level, we found that actually a somewhat later starting age, relatively speaking, still in childhood, right? But a somewhat later starting age and more diverse early experience with sports, playing multiple sports. Okay, so what these hypotheses that you're referring to pertain to is explaining this. Okay, and then also, as a reminder, for the junior level, we found kind of the opposite. We found that what happens there, the elite juniors, they start really early, they specialize really early, and they have a very steep ascent to that level of performance. Whereas the elites progress more rapidly initially and then shoot up. Okay, so the question is, okay, what can explain this? These results. So the sustainability hypothesis, this is the idea that by having more diverse early experience, you reduce the likelihood of burnout and overuse injury. Okay, so kids who start super early, they specialize really early, they're at a heightened risk for burnout and injury. Okay.
Yeah.
Kids who start
that makes sense. Yeah.
somewhat later and play multiple other sports, they're at a lower likelihood for burnout and overuse injury. Okay. So, in other words, the more diverse early experience is more sustainable. Right?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's
the first part that kind of explains why that may be the case.
Right.
And the second part is this multiple sampling and functional matching hypothesis, which sounds like a lot, but basically is this better chance of figuring out what you're good at, which is related to this deliberate practice, because some people have what we call talent, whatever that is. It's going to make them have better matchups.
Yep.
Is that correct?
That's it. So here's the basic idea, just to build on what you said. Okay, so let's take it for the sake of argument here, for the sake of let's assume that there's something called talent, some constellation of traits and characteristics that's going to make you better suited for one sport versus the other. Okay. And the only way that you can figure out what that sport is by playing multiple sports. Right? Yeah. Now, if you specialize really early, you might luck out and you choose golf, and it just so happens that what you bring to the table and what golf demands match up nicely. Okay. But you might pick wrong, right? You might have been better at soccer, or you might have been better at swimming, or you might have been better at badminton. Okay. And the only way that you can know, of course, is if you play multiple sports, you sample, so to speak. And
it makes sense also in general, if you're trying to find a career path or something, if you've been exposed to more things, maybe you realize what you actually like, what you're good at.
Yeah. Yeah. And what you raise an interesting connection between being good at something and liking it. It's also likely to be the case that what you like is also what you tend to be good at. Okay. And so that's that hypothesis. That's another reason why, another possible explanation for why a more diverse pattern of early sports activity and participation might be optimal for achieving a high level of success ultimately at the adult level, right?
Yeah.
And
okay, so far we've got sustainability, reduced risk of burnout and injury by playing a variety of sports. Second part is potentially finding a better match between what a person has in talent and what suits them. And then the third is going to be this transfer as preparation for future learning, which I think is a bit more complex and kind of has two parts to it. But
it is.
I'll just read a quote from that first part. Like there's kind of two premises that get mentioned is this: amplified variation in learning tasks and situations may facilitate athletes' ability to adapt their intentions and perceptual and motor actions in learning. So can you try and help the average listener understand, like, what does that actually mean?
Yes. So this third hypothesis, transfers preparation for future learning hypothesis, it basically says that where sports is concerned, it says that playing multiple sports, okay, actually early on has a positive impact on a person's ability to learn a single sport once they've decided what to focus on. Okay. So the kid who plays baseball and basketball and football, maybe Jordan Spieth, and also golf, okay, that more varied experience early on actually will be beneficial once the athlete decides what to focus on. And this is in some ways kind of the most intriguing, but also the most speculative of these hypotheses. Okay. So you brought up this idea about varied experiences and varied learning experiences. Okay. And so an example of this, as we note in the paper, so practicing broader ranges of skills, experiencing varied practice drills, conditioned game formats, varying coach-athlete interaction. Okay, all of these varied experiences are then beneficial once you decide to focus. You learn different coaching styles, and you can bring to bear in, let's say you're Jordan Spieth and you've decided to focus on golf at some point, and that's going to be the major focus. Well, you can draw on all of the wisdom and all the lessons that you learned from your basketball coach and your football coach and your hockey coach or whatever.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of
that last part is also the the second, that two-part premise. The second part is also, it's also about learning, but also you get to kind of know more what suits you, how to interact with these different types of coaching styles, and over time developing what you realize, kind of learning more about yourself in terms of how you operate.
Yeah, exactly.
Well within an environment.
How you're going to regulate your own motivation, for example. Deliberate practice is hard. It's drudgery, almost by definition. And you may have gleaned kind of self-regulatory strategies that work best for you through varied coaching, being exposed to different types of coaching, different styles of coaching. So yeah, this is the kind of the sense of this third hypothesis.
Yeah, I think that's important for people to understand that. Okay, well, what are the potential underlying reasons that early diversification is better?
Right.
And then a big point for me, at least when I read the paper, was moving on to this differentiation between coach-led versus youth-led, because you also mentioned that there are differences there. And from my understanding that coach-led practice is still important even within that
Yes.
early diversification.
Right. That's right. So when we look at benefits of playing other sports early on, what's beneficial is coach-led playing is coach-led activities in other sports.
Yeah,
that's right.
I think that's interesting also from a parenting perspective or in general, that it's not a matter of let me just, send them and they have no sort of any formal structure at all during their development. There's still value in having a diverse set of sports you're playing, but still have some sort of guidance and structure from a coach.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. And
interesting.
This is something that, going back to the deliberate practice concept, Erickson frequently emphasized the importance of having a coach or an instructor. Now, we could get into, there was some ambiguity in his writings about whether or not you have to have a coach or an instructor for it to qualify as deliberate practice. But he certainly was emphatic on that point in some of his writings, that it's critical to have an instructor or coach. Yeah. And I think that it's quite interesting as to why this is the case. And one of the things that I suspect you appreciate, being an expert instructor, is that people will come in thinking they know something about the golf swing, but they really don't. This is a revelation I've had about in my own golf game. I've, in fairly recent, over the past 10 years or so, I've gotten serious about getting good, high quality instruction. And I was struck by kind of the limits on my own knowledge about the golf swing. Once I got into this, I came in thinking I know a little about the golf swing, to thinking like I really don't know much about the golf swing, and I'm going to listen to people who do, because knowledge about how to best swing a golf club has accumulated within the profession of golf, and the layperson, it's like a scientific field. The layperson may think they know something about it, but they really don't. It's highly technical, very complicated body of knowledge. And then,
Absolutely.
So that's one point. And then the other point is, before I started taking lessons seriously, I would watch my golf swing and I don't know what to look at, and
it's
an
expert eye versus a novice eye.
Yeah,
exactly. Different information.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things I've come to appreciate is that you, as the expert golf instructor, you're looking for something like a little difference of movement that is barely discernible to the novice eye, right? Mm-hmm. You can, when you illustrate the point, you make an exaggerated motion to illustrate it, but in the swing, it particularly at a high level of skill, you could put two golf swings in two frames, a bad swing and a better swing, or a good swing and the better swing. And like, I could look at it and like, I don't see any difference. So this is part of what happens when people become an expert in something, is the ability to discern fine, almost microscopic differences.
And I think even, going back to performance, because that's also what, the Golf Performance Newsletter and all these conversations is about, that even within let's say, to me, golf performance is a swing instruction, or swing is like one subdivision of golf performance. And ultimately, that's why in talking to you or understanding what expertise really is important, because same like you mentioned, I think of it as deliberate practice can't explain by itself why someone's on a PGA tour and another person
Right.
isn't.
Right.
Same way, we can't say it's only the swing technique that is the determining factor in
Absolutely.
somebody's performance on the tour. So there must be these other factors, which I think is a kind of analogy to what you were saying. Like there's innate ability, there's innate talent, there's mental performance, there's all these other factors.
Yeah.
And a lot of times I feel like in the golf industry, we zero in on that one very important factor.
Right.
I mean, there's no guy on the tour that doesn't swing the club functionally well.
Right.
But there are other elements to it, just like there's other elements to just deliberate practice.
Sure. And I think you'd probably agree that the person on, or the people on the tour who swing the club the best, technically, they're not necessarily people who are winning lots of tournaments and majors.
No. Definitely not. It's such a small margin of difference between Korn Ferry Tour, PGA Tour. It's marginal differences, and that's where these other elements come into play, other than just the swing technique.
Right. Kind of the ability to regulate your emotions, your thoughts.
Exactly.
I keep using Jordan Spieth as an example, at least to my eye. I mean, Jordan, he obviously he's a good enough ball striker, but I'm not sure you would say, I mean, and this is somebody who's won how many majors, 3 or 4? This is not somebody who, if you just looked at his stats and you looked at his swing, you might not predict that he would be as good as he has turned out to be.
Yeah. Whereas you would see, you could look. I would love to, if there was research once on, tracking all-time best AJGA, like over like a long-term study of how they end up. To me, would be fascinating.
Okay, so I've had the exact same thought. So we should do that study. We could collaborate.
We should do that study. We should do that. After this call, we'll do that.
Okay,
but it's so fascinating.
I've already. Let me see if I've got the data here. I know you can edit out certain things right.
No worries.
Actually, I don't have the data right here, but yeah. Okay, so go look at Rolex, players of the year and first team, and of course there are some who will win, AJ or Rolex junior player of the year, Tiger Woods, Phil Mickelson, but there are many who never made it on the PGA Tour at all, even in some cases dominated at the junior level. Then there are others who, Brian Harmon's a great example of somebody who he dominated junior golf, and he's had a successful career, but kind of a journeyman, player. I mean, a great player, but not what you would have predicted based on his junior performance. And I hope you get an opportunity to talk to Ani Gulish in Germany. He can tell you.
Yeah, I'm going to talk to him next week.
Awesome. You'll really like him. He's
for the listeners, who is that person you just referred to?
Ani Gulish is my collaborator. He's internationally renowned sports scientist in Germany, and he's the lead of these projects that we've been talking about. He's really the leader of this research. So I'm the collaborator, and he's kind of the leader, along with Brooke McNamara at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland. She's plays an integral role in kind of the methodological and statistical work, and also the conceptual. But she's an expert on the actual statistical techniques that we use in this. But I think Ani will probably tell you about some other work that it's not yet published, but what we're doing is we're looking at the likelihood that an elite junior goes on to become an elite senior, and conversely, the likelihood that someone who has reached the elite senior level was an elite junior. And these percentages are small. These elite juniors and elite seniors are essentially two different populations. It does happen.
To me, it's. I think of it as, in one way, good information for a young golfer who's in that, let's say, a top AJGA player, to have that awareness, like, okay, I'm not guaranteed success for the future, but also I think it's a message of hope for that person that might be listening. That is, I'm 19, I didn't even play in college.
Right.
That doesn't mean you can't be
correct.
You couldn't in theory. It doesn't. You don't have to be the winner on every AJGA event or even compete to be able to, because the data doesn't show that the pool of PGA Tour players are not just existing from former top 5, top 10 AJGA players.
That's exactly right. I think you hit the nail on the head with that. It was quite surprised that we didn't know how this would turn out. And this pattern holds across essentially all sports. And it's really, I think that this is not what a lot of people would predict. They would predict, oh yeah, the PGA Tour players, they were always at an elite level. Like, no, actually not.
It's probably just a part of the development of how media works, is that there's more attention on these amazing, incredible stories, but those are the exceptions, not the rule.
Yes, and that is another really important point, and that is that when you read like a news story, let's say it's about when Tiger Woods hit the scene, okay, there was all of this, particularly when he won the Masters in '97, there were, this avalanche of news stories about his early training, and people really got into, starting their babies out playing golf and going to turn them into the next Tiger Woods and this sort of thing. But this is Tiger Woods he's a sample of one. He's a case study. This is anecdotal evidence as opposed to empirical, systematic evidence, and his success is undeniable. But he's the exception rather than the rule, where early specialization and later success is concerned.
Absolutely. I want to switch gears a bit. The one last main topic I wanted to cover before we get into kind of some practical advice from your perspective is in the paper, like these talent development pathways, which to me is very important and a very difficult topic, because basically my question to you would be, from that research, what role do the talent development pathways? And so for golf, we could say if you're part of a national squad or a regional golf squad, or you're kind of going that AJGA route, what is the relationship? Because from my understanding, it kind of fosters early specialization.
It does. And as we point out, this is not necessarily the way to go. In fact, our evidence suggests it's not the way to go. The way that people are selected for entry into elite academies often is just based on junior record. Okay, and our point on that is that you'll if you do that, you'll maximize accolades at the junior level, but that'll be detrimental to. It's not the wisest strategy where long-term development of the athletes is concerned. And also, as we discussed earlier, it puts these young athletes at risk of burnout, overuse injury. So
and the whole system is essentially, also in the paper talks about how coaches are, their contracts, their compensation is all based on immediate results. So they're also incentivized. Like, if you have the choice, I have this kid who's already shooting mid-70s, or I have this kid who is maybe a bit slower developing and shooting 82s. He's not incentivized to really keep that lagging behind player. He should take the better, or he or she should take that better player at that point.
And so then you get into a bigger discussion about kind of the incentive structure for these sorts of coaches. They have, they're evaluated based on the performance of the people they get at that time. So it's hard, you can't blame them, right? But it's not necessarily the best strategy for the long-term development of the athletes.
And for families, then I find that I can imagine they feel a pressure that they have to kind of go along with this path. Like, we need to kind of early specialize, otherwise they're not going to be in the national squad or the regional squad, and then there's no. It's difficult to get back in later on. Later, as in when they're a bit older in their childhood.
Yeah.
So it's quite a conflicting.
It is.
Conflicting system based on what the evidence actually shows on how talent develops.
Well, and have you seen King Richard, the movie about the Williams? Mm-hmm. So it was a stroke of genius on the part of their father to recognize that the potential harm of getting the sisters, Venus and Serena, over involved in the competitive tennis at a junior level. It's almost as if he kind of intuitively understood that there were real potential downsides to that, and it worked out. Needless to say.
It definitely did, yeah. But yeah, I think that's a difficult dynamic. And before we kind of recap the main points, from your perspective, obviously just in general, it doesn't have to be only for golf, but what recommendations would you have for parents? Because the parents play a big role in this. It's one thing if the kid says it, but what recommendations do you have in general for families that want to support their child on that expertise journey?
Yeah, what I would say is, first of all, encourage and allow them to play multiple sports, if we're talking about sports, or if it's academics, of course, to pursue multiple subjects. This early sampling period, our data suggests, is really important. And then also listen to them I would encourage parents to listen to their kids about what the kids like, because if a kid just hates some sport, it's going to be really hard for them to sustain any kind of prolonged, intense involvement in it. They'll quit, they'll get burned out, and they'll be resentful towards their parents. So I would say...
And also, going back to that hypothesis, you're limiting their chance of... They might like something, but they don't know that they might like something else even more.
Exactly. The early sampling, yes. This is a little bit of a sidebar, but I'll while we're talking about this, This also fits very well with a concept from research in the area of behavioral genetics. So looking at the role of environmental and genetic factors to differences across people and traits and characteristics. And one of this concept is called gene-environment interplay, and more specifically, gene-environment correlation. And this is the notion that our genetic makeup and in our environment are not independent of one another. We tend to seek out and to create environments in part based on our genetically influenced abilities, propensities, traits, and characteristics. So in terms of what we talked about, it's you think of you bring to the table for a sport, you bring to the table a certain set of abilities and traits that might be conducive to one sport versus the other. Okay, you're going to gravitate towards the sport, that sport that is the closest match to what you bring to the table. Okay, so this is an instance of this gene environment correlation phenomenon playing out in how kids select sports. Okay, and the only way that you can allow this natural process to operate is to give kids the opportunity to try lots of things.
That makes a lot of sense. It's very
Ultimately
interesting.
Find the one that they like the most, and which they may have the greatest potential for success in.
Okay. So before we kind of conclude and want to get last follow-up questions, kind of recap. So basically, the take-home message is that playing a variety of sports early on and then specializing later on is better in terms of elite performance at the senior level.
Correct.
And
That's
then
correct.
the three reasons that is the case, or the three hypotheses that are presented, is this idea of sustainability hypothesis that
Yep.
we're less likely to burn out,
Yep.
not going to get as likely to be injured because
Yep.
we're engaged in a variety of sports.
Yep.
The second part is that we're able to try different sports and sample things and find
Yes.
a better match, kind of going back
Correct.
to this, what we naturally bring to the table.
Correct.
Like in terms of talent, whatever that may be, finding a good
Correct.
match between us. Otherwise, you might get lucky and happen to choose the first time you choose, but probability is that you probably didn't choose the best match.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
the third part is that you're being exposed to different coaching styles, environments, learning and opportunities, and that helps you later on with
Yep.
that specialized focus in one
Exactly.
sport.
Yep, you got
And
it.
then we talked about how coach-led practice, even early on, is still
Yes.
important. It's not only a matter of having
Right.
them play by themselves, but structure is
Correct.
still valuable.
Yes.
And then that this idea of deliberate practice, while it is a thing and it is important, it's not what sometimes is presented as it's the determining factor by
Right.
itself.
That's right.
That anybody
Right.
just with deliberate practice can
Yeah.
reach world
Yeah,
class. And you
right.
talked
That
about
you
that.
just put in your
That
10,000
chess
hours.
person.
Right. Yeah, right. That the idea that, you just put in your 10,000 hours and you're virtually guaranteed that you'll reach an elite level. No. I wanted to, on that note, in the real world, in ordinary experience, if you get involved in something and you're just really bad at it, I mean, then you don't sustain for any period of time what would qualify as deliberate practice. Either you quit the thing altogether, or you just settle into being a weekend golfer and you're bad, but you go out and drink beer and have fun with your friends. Okay. There was this unusual case where the guy, Dan McLaughlin, decided to quit his day job and try to make it to the PGA Tour through 10,000 hours of practice. And he certainly improved. And by the end of about 6,000 hours, he injured his back and had to quit the project. And he was a reasonably good player, maybe a 4 or 5 handicapper, but he was, worlds away from where he would need to get to make it to any competitive professional level. But his case was kind of unusual in that he set out with this project. He was going to accumulate this practice. He had that's not the way that we ordinarily pursue something, in other words, like he was not on trajectory to make it to the PGA Tour, but he was going to keep at it until he got injured.
And another related to that is appreciating the fact that there are some limiting factors that might not let you get to where you want to be, but also another key take-home message to me was that just because you're not successful at a junior level doesn't mean you cannot be successful to a certain degree at a senior level.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And I think that you really hit the nail on the head. That this is a finding that can give people hope. And also for the people who are performing really high at the junior level, it's kind of a caution. Like, just because you're, racking up the AJGA titles doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to coast into, the Korn Ferry and then on to the PGA Tour. So.
Absolutely.
It usually doesn't work that way.
Kind of wanted to finish on, if you want to talk on what you kind of alluded to it, current projects, what you're working on or what your expertise lab is working on, and if you had any book or book or paper recommendations for people, doesn't have to be related to this at all, just anything that you enjoy.
I've been working on with Ani Gullish, who you're going to talk to, and Brooke McNamara and Michael Barth. We've been doing this work on early versus late specialization, and then also the likelihood of reaching an elite level if you were an elite junior, on whether elite juniors and elite seniors are one or two different populations. That's been a focus of the expertise lab. Now that work is led. I'm not the leader of that work. That work is led by Ani in Germany. But in my lab, we've set up a golf putting lab, and so we've been looking at choking under pressure and trying to measure differences across people in the propensity to choke under pressure. And we've looked at it not only in golf, but also we're trying to look at it in other types of activities like dart throwing, for example. And so those have been some major foci. As far as books and articles, I had a 2018 book called The Science of Expertise, Behavioral, Neural, and Genetic Approaches to Complex Skill. This is an edited book. I edited it with some colleagues, and there are bunches of chapters that touch on everything that we've talked about today, really, that people might be interested in. Unfortunately, I don't have a copy right in front of me, or otherwise I would hold it up, but people can find it.
I can link to it for sure.
Yeah, you could put a link to it. That'd be great.
That was my conversation with Dr. Zack Hambrick. If you enjoyed today's podcast episode, consider subscribing to the Golf Performance Newsletter. All the relevant links from today's episode and to my newsletter will be linked below. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.